Today we have something very special. We have a 1/9 scale Kommander Sorscha bust from Privateer Press, and it is a very nice resin piece. Very clean cast, just a few seam lines here and there to clean up, and it is ready for paint. Main thing we're going to be doing here is, on this part, is painting the skin, i.e. the face. And also, we're going to go the extra mile on this figure and do a lot of layers and paint up a really nice display piece. The goal here is to paint a rather pale skin tone to match her Siberian-esque setting. And we are actually starting off with a undercoat of Vallejo Model Color Rose Brown. Starting on the highlights, our first layer is going to be a mix of the Rose Brown mixed with some Vallejo Model Color Beige Red. And this color is very thin. We're going to build it up very slowly so we get a nice smooth transition between our layers, which is very important because the minimal contrast that we're going for with this pale skin tone, and also because it's a larger piece. Those large flat areas, gotta keep your paint real thin so we don't get any brush strokes showing up at the end. Our next highlight is basic skin tone mixed with our previous two colors and continuing to build up the highlights. Once again, very thin paint, slowly building up that color to the proper shade so we get no brush strokes in the end. Our next highlight layer, once again the same three color combination, this time with more of the basic skin tone added. One thing to keep in mind when highlighting is always turn the figure. Make sure you're getting the highlights on the sides, everywhere it needs to be applied. It's very easy to just stare straight at the face and apply the highlights from the front, but I always got to remember to turn the face so I can get the highlights along the jawline, or make sure they go far enough around on the cheeks. So just keep turning the figure, make sure everything's being highlighted properly. And then our final highlight color, well, I should say final for the moment, is Vallejo Model Color Basic Skin Tone mixed with some Vallejo Panzer Aces Highlight Flesh. And picking out those highest highlights, top of the chin, just very top of the lip, cheekbones, nose. Doing this in very small quantities, very specific areas. Now it's time for some shade. We got to paint in those shadows. Two things to point out here. First of all, because this is a larger scale figure, we can actually paint in the shadows. We don't have to worry about using washes or working like I normally do from darkest to lightest to layer in the shadows or leave them where they be. And the second thing is, because we want a pale skin tone, we don't want to go too dark with the shadows. Pale skin, want to limit the amount of contrast, especially since this is a female face. We don't have the same bone structure as a male face would, so we have to limit the contrast a little bit. Our first shade color is going back to our original Rose Brown, and I've mixed it with some Vallejo Model Color Violet Red. And then for our deeper shade, I've mixed in some Vallejo Game Color Stormy Blue to the previous mix, and working that in just underneath the chin and those deep recessed areas around the face where it hits the hair, and also a little bit underneath the eyebrow ridge. So now we have a majority of our shade and highlights placed. Now we need to add a little bit of color. We need to give a little bit of rose to that cheeks, make her look a bit more human. And for that we're using, once again, Vallejo Model Color Rose Brown, this time mixed with some Model Color Magenta. And very, very thin, just working it underneath the cheekbones to add a little color to her face. After applying it, I decided to soften the look a little bit, work it in a bit more to the surrounding skin area. So a few thin glazes of Vallejo Model Color Beige Red were applied just to blend those areas in a bit better. And I went back to this color a few times in some areas where I thought the transition just wasn't right. Little beige red helped to fix things up. I mentioned before we weren't quite done with the highlights, and turned out to be true because I decided to go back and lighten up the skin just a little bit more, and using that final highlight color that we used, the Panzer Ace's Highlight Flesh and Basic Skin Tone, made a very thin glaze of that, and I just worked it a little bit deeper into the base coat and shade areas to give an overall lightened look to the skin, lighten her up a bit. And that's the good thing about painting, is nothing's permanent. You can always go back, fix things. I did go back and forth a few times here, increase base coat here, highlight here, increase a shade, work those colors back and forth over each other. Adds a little bit of variety to the skin and helps improve things. You know, once you get the shade down, you may realize you need to increase the highlights, things like that. So rework your areas as you need them is what I'm trying to get the point here. And by using thin layers, you can just slightly tint areas without having to completely repaint them. And then since I brought that final, in quotes, highlight color a little bit further into the base coat, that meant that I needed a new final highlight color. So straight Panzer Ace's Highlight Flesh reapplied over the areas where we originally did the final highlight. Once again, as I said before, very thin layers. So carefully blending them in, and finally we're done with the highlights. Time to paint the eyes. They were base coated with Vallejo Game Color Wolf Gray mixed with white. And then for the eyes themselves, dotting the area in with black, and then adding the color with some Vallejo Model Color Deep Green. To highlight, we've mixed in some Game Color Escorpena Green to our Deep Green, and adding a highlight to the bottom portion of the eye. That's because the eyebrow ridge on top would prevent the highlight from being on the top of the eye like we would normally do for a regular highlight. Then a drop of white in the slightly off-center upper right hand of the eye, followed by exact center for the pupil, very small drop of Vallejo Game Color German Gray. And then we finish off with a little bit of red, Vallejo Model Color Flat Red, very, very thin, as you can see, just adding a little drop, not even a drop, a little thin wipe in each corner of the eye, just to give that added sense of realism to the eyeball. Once the eyes were finished, I can tell that I still needed a little bit more shade underneath that eyebrow ridge, so some Vallejo Game Color Stormy Blue took care of that. To make the face look just a little bit more interesting, I decided to give her freckles. Very, very light freckles. I want to keep this thing subtle. And so, once again, Vallejo Model Color Flat Red mixed with a heavy amount of glaze medium, which will help keep them more transparent without thinning them out too much and having the paint start to separate. So, a few spots and then just carefully working them in with a brush. Time to paint the lips, and for that we're using Vallejo Model Color 926 Red. And we're doing both lips. If it was a smaller scale figure, we can get away with just painting the bottom lip. can't do that on this larger scale figure. However, all the highlights we're going to be adding are just going to be on the more prominent lower lip. And for the highlights, once again, Rose Brown returns, added to our 926 red. And adding the flesh color to a reddish brown is always a standard go-to for lip color. Next, we add some white to our previous two-color mix and proceed to highlight the bottom lip once again. And you can see I'm doing an up and down pattern on the lips so we get some texture to them. What you're seeing here is a little bit too harsh. I did go back with some thin glazes of the previous two-color mix to soften it out a little bit. And then we finish off with just a spot of white to give a gloss look to the lips, which honestly I'm not too sure would be proper for a figure of this scale, but after finishing the figure, I liked it, so I decided to leave it. And here you get a sneak peek of the finished model. I couldn't decide if I wanted to add makeup to her or not. Being a warrior woman, you know, you don't want to go too heavy on the makeup. So I decided to finish the entire figure, and then in the end I went back and decided to add some, mainly because I haven't done too much makeup painting, especially in this scale, so I figured it would at least be good practice, even if it wasn't appropriate. Does improve the look though of the figure. So using a mix of black mixed with game color pale flesh, and just adding some eyeliner to her around the top and the bottom of the eyes. And then for a little bit of eyeshadow, I have some very thin Vallejo Model Color Oxford Blue, adding that above the eyes. And after doing that, I'm much happier with the look of the figure because it gives her a much more intense stare, just adding that dark line and dark colors around the eye area. And it's not a huge makeup job, so I think it still works with the figure. So that's one portion of our Sorscha figure done. Still have one or two more parts left. Not sure which yet. I haven't begun editing those. But we have a lot of red to paint in our future, as you can see. So come back soon, and thanks for watching.
Fun, fun, fun! That's nice. Come on!